He screamed at her to get out and slammed the door shut. 6 years later, the millionaire CEO froze as his son stepped out of a limousine. Welcome to another story of unexpected twists and heartfelt redemption. Before we begin, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories. Also, let us know in the comments what you think the price of control is. The price of control. Alexander, the CEO of a vast investment empire, had built his life on control, on being steady when others wavered, on silencing doubt before it could take root. He was accustomed to people obeying his every word, to doors opening for him, to his commands being treated as law. In his world, there was no room for weakness, no tolerance for mistakes, and certainly no place for the messy complications of the heart. So when Eleanor stood before him in his office, her hands trembling, her eyes holding as much fear as hope, to tell him she was expecting his child, his carefully cultivated facade cracked into a furious rage. The blue of his eyes, normally cold and calculating, burned with something sharp and unforgiving. He didn't think about the sleepless nights she must have endured before coming to him, or the courage it must have taken to face him with the truth. All he saw was a threat to his order, an interruption to the immaculate empire he had built brick by brick, and he lashed out. His voice, usually quiet and commanding in boardrooms, rose like a whip. "Get out! Get out!" he screamed, and when she flinched, he turned, slammed the heavy door, and told himself it was over. For Eleanor, that moment wasn't just a rejection, it was an annihilation. She stood in the door's echo, her body shaking, his words reverberating inside her skull like a cruel mantra she knew she'd never forget. The man she had loved, the man she had entrusted her heart to, had erased her with a single command. She brought a hand to her stomach, where the tiny life was growing, and felt the warm tears slide down her cheeks. It wasn't just her pain she carried now, it was her son's future, and she realized in that instant that she was truly alone. The gleaming skyline she could see from his office window seemed to mock her, each brilliant light a reminder of the distance between his world and hers. She turned and walked away, her steps heavy but steady, refusing to collapse in a place where he could still witness her weakness. What would you have done in Eleanor's place? Would you have stayed or walked away? Let us know in the comments. Alexander, for his part, convinced himself he had done the right thing. He threw himself into work that night, staying long after his staff had gone home, pretending the numbers and charts could drown out the echo of her voice. He told himself that women came and went, that children born of mistakes had no place in his carefully ordered life. Yet, beneath the anger, beneath the certainty, there was a flicker of something he refused to acknowledge. Fear. He had always prided himself on control, but the image of Eleanor's face, pale with shock, haunted him despite his efforts to bury it. When he left his office hours later, the silence of his empty penthouse felt heavier than usual, but he dismissed it with the same cold logic he had used his entire life. Eleanor's night was different. She returned to her small apartment across town, her clothes damp from the rain that had begun to fall, her mind reeling from the enormity of what had just happened. She sat on the edge of her bed, the room dimly lit by the weak glow of a single lamp, and she allowed herself to cry until her throat was raw. She thought of his eyes, of how they had once softened when he looked at her, and how they had now become ice. She thought of the promises she had whispered to herself during sleepless nights, when she imagined telling him, and how quickly those hopes had been crushed beneath his rage. But as the hours passed and her tears subsided, something else began to take hold. It wasn't the burning passion of love she had once felt, nor the cold despair of rejection, but a slow, steady flame of determination. If he would not be a father, if he would not share the burden, then she would carry it alone. She looked around her apartment, at the second-hand furniture, the peeling paint, the faint sound of the city outside her window, and she knew it would never be easy. She would face long days, sleepless nights, and a future filled with uncertainty. Yet, as she placed her hand once more on her stomach, she felt a fierce, protective strength rise within her. This child was hers, and she would love him enough for both of them. Alexander may have slammed the door on her, but he would not define her future. She whispered a promise into the quiet of the room, her voice unsteady but resolute. "You are not alone. I will never leave you." And with those words, Eleanor stepped onto a path she had not chosen, but one she would walk with unwavering courage, a path that would one day bring her face to face with the man who had tried to erase her, and the child who carried his eyes. The lonely journey. Eleanor quickly learned that survival required more strength than she ever imagined she possessed. The weeks after Alexander's rejection settled into a rhythm of exhaustion, fear, and resolve. Her savings were almost gone, and each day presented a new hurdle. Late rent notices on her door, long shifts at the library where she struggled to keep her eyes open, and the constant worry of how she would support the child growing inside her. She traded her own comfort for necessity, skipping meals to save money, mending her clothes instead of buying new, and learning to stretch every dollar until it nearly broke. Often she would sit up late at night at her tiny kitchen table, a pile of unpaid bills in front of her, her hands shaking as she tried to calculate how much longer she could hold on. Yet each time she felt despair would swallow her, she would place a hand on her stomach and remind herself that she was no longer fighting just for her. The pregnancy was harder alone than she had expected. She faced doctor's appointments with no one by her side, listening to her child's heartbeat for the first time as she wiped away silent tears, wishing there was someone to share the miracle with. Every flutter of movement inside her filled her with joy, but it also sharpened the ache of knowing that the man responsible wanted no part of it. As she walked home from the clinic through busy streets, surrounded by rushing strangers, she often felt invisible, as if the world had already decided her story was too small to matter. Yet she refused to crumble. She told herself over and over again that her son deserved a mother who wouldn't give up, even if his father had already walked away. As her belly grew, so did her determination. She found ways to prepare, setting aside a small box in her room, where she collected baby clothes from second-hand shops, discarded toys from wealthier families, and blankets knitted by a kind elderly neighbor who had taken pity on her. Every item she placed in that box felt like a quiet victory against the man who had slammed the door in her face. She would whisper to her unborn child as she folded the clothes, promising him that no matter how little they had, love would always be abundant. These whispered promises became her anchor, a way to fend off the fear that threatened to unspool her on sleepless nights, when her back ached and her future felt uncertain. Eleanor went into labor on a stormy night, alone in her apartment, the rain lashing against the windows as she fought through the pain. When she was rushed to the hospital, she was shaking with exhaustion, her cries swallowed by the sterile walls of the delivery room. Hours later, at dawn, she held her son in her arms for the first time. His hair was damp against her chest, and when he opened his eyes, they were the same piercing blue as Alexander's. The sight made her heart ache painfully, but then the baby's tiny fingers curled around hers, and in that moment, she felt a wave of love so overwhelming it eclipsed everything else. She named him Daniel, a name that meant strength, because she knew they would both need all the strength they could find. The days that followed were both beautiful and brutal. Daniel cried through the nights, leaving Eleanor with no sleep, her body still aching from the delivery. She rocked him in her arms until her muscles burned. She sang to him when she could barely keep her eyes open, and sometimes she would cry silently into his soft hair when the weight of it all felt unbearable. But each time he smiled, each time his small lips curved into that innocent expression, it felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She lived for those smiles, for the warmth of his small body against hers, for the proof that even from rejection and cruelty, something pure and extraordinary had been born. Eleanor learned to navigate motherhood with fierce determination. She returned to work sooner than she should have, leaving Daniel in the care of her neighbor, serving coffee at the cafe in the mornings and shelving books at the library in the afternoons. Her body protested, her spirit waned, but she kept going. She counted coins at night to ensure she could afford diapers and formula, often choosing to go without dinner so Daniel would never be hungry. She told herself it didn't matter if she wore the same worn dress day after day, if she had to sacrifice sleep and comfort, because Daniel deserved better. And slowly, against all odds, they forged a fragile but unbreakable life together. Eleanor often wondered what Alexander would think if he saw them. Would he recognize something of himself in the blue of Daniel's eyes? Would he feel guilt, or would he turn away again, dismissing them as he had once done? The questions lingered, but she never allowed them to consume her. She decided that his choices no longer defined her or her son. Daniel was hers, fully and completely, and she would raise him without shame. Still, deep in her heart, she knew that one day their paths might cross again, and when that moment came, she would finally see what he had turned his back on. The collision. Daniel grew quickly. Each year unfolded like a chapter that Eleanor read with awe and exhaustion, marked by small triumphs and quiet sacrifices. When he turned 3, he was a whirlwind of curiosity, pulling Eleanor's hand in the park and asking questions about the sky, the birds, and the people passing by. His energy seemed endless, his laughter infectious, and though Eleanor's body often ached from the long shifts and sleepless nights, she found strength in the sound of his joy. Each milestone felt like a victory snatched from the jaws of despair. The first word, the first wobbly step across the living room, the first time he wrapped his arms around her neck and whispered, "Mommy," in a voice that melted every scar she carried. However, the joy was shadowed by the inevitable questions that grew more direct as Daniel grew older. At first, they were innocent. "Why don't I have a daddy? Why don't we visit him?" But as he reached school age, the curiosity sharpened into a yearning. He would see other children being picked up by their fathers, their hands tucked securely in larger ones, their laughter doubled by the presence of someone who belonged to them. Daniel would turn to Eleanor with his big blue eyes, so much like Alexander's, that pierced her heart each time, and he would ask in a quiet voice if his daddy could come one day. Eleanor would kneel down, brush the hair from his forehead, and give him the same answer as always. "You have me, and that's enough." But each time she said it, she felt the weight of the lie press harder. Eleanor tried to fill every void with love. She worked double shifts when she could, sacrificing her own needs to pay for Daniel's art supplies, his books, and the occasional treat that made his face light up with wonder. Their apartment remained small and modest, but she transformed it into a home filled with warmth. Daniel's drawings were taped to the walls, bright, crooked scribbles that turned the peeling paint into a gallery of color. The refrigerator was adorned with magnets and notes, reminders of school events, and small drawings he made just for her. At night, they would sit together on the couch with secondhand storybooks, Daniel curled against her as she read until his eyelids grew heavy. She told him fairy tales where heroes fought monsters, but deep down, she knew that the greatest monster she had ever faced was the man who had abandoned them. Despite the struggles, Eleanor never let resentment seep into her interactions with her son. She wanted Daniel to grow up believing in love, not poisoned by her own pain. Still, the shadow of Alexander lingered in every blue gaze, in every sharp tilt of Daniel's chin that mirrored his father's, in every smile that seemed to echo a face she wished she could forget. Sometimes at night, after Daniel was asleep, Eleanor would sit by the window and stare out at the city, wondering if Alexander ever thought of them, if he ever felt a single moment of guilt for the life he had thrown away. She doubted it. Men like him didn't look back. But what Eleanor didn't know was that Alexander's life, though gilded and gleaming on the outside, had begun to feel emptier with each passing year. He had everything money could buy: cars, penthouses, women who fawned over his wealth. But none of it anchored him. He buried himself in work, closing deals that earned him headlines. Yet in the quiet moments when the crowds dispersed, an empty ache settled in his chest. He told himself this was the price of power, that men like him were not meant for family, not meant for permanence. Yet in the quiet moments when he took off his tie and looked in the mirror, he saw something that unsettled him. His own eyes, cold and blue, staring back at him with no warmth, no life. What he didn't realize, at least not consciously, was that the memory of Eleanor haunted him more than he dared to admit. He had told her to disappear. He had slammed the door on a future he didn't want. Yet her face, framed by dark hair and filled with a mixture of pain and defiance, would sometimes surface in his thoughts without warning. He buried the memory under work, under deals and headlines, but it never fully went away. And sometimes, in the stillness of the night, he would wonder, not about her, but about what she had taken with her. He had convinced himself that the life she had built no longer concerned him, but deep down there was a fear he would never say aloud. What if she had kept the child? What if there was a son or a daughter out there who carried his blood, his name, his face? The thought came like a knife, quick and sharp, before he pushed it away with ruthless efficiency. Alexander did not dwell on the past. Meanwhile, Eleanor lived a life worlds away from the shining towers where Alexander reigned. Her world was measured not in millions, but in hours and dollars, carefully stretched to cover her son's needs. She walked him to school every morning, holding his hand as they walked along cracked sidewalks, his little backpack bouncing against his shoulders. She worked shifts that left her exhausted, but her evenings were filled with Daniel's chatter, his questions about dinosaurs, his excitement over a new library book. To Eleanor, wealth was not something she could hold in her hands. It was something she felt in the warmth of her son's embrace. She saw Alexander's features in him every day: the blue eyes, the shape of his jaw, the set of his chin. And while it brought a pang of memory, it also reminded her that Daniel was more than the product of rejection. He was proof that love could exist even when it was born of cruelty. As Daniel grew, his resemblance to Alexander became undeniable. Neighbors would often comment on his striking eyes, not knowing the story behind them, and Eleanor would smile politely as her stomach clenched. Each time she heard those comments, she felt the past rising again, pressing against the walls she had built around her heart. She knew that one day Daniel would demand answers, and she feared the moment with every fiber of her being. She told herself that she would be enough, that her love would protect him. But the truth whispered to her through her fears. No matter how strong she was, a child would always yearn to know the other half of himself. Across the city, Alexander's restlessness grew. His empire was thriving, but satisfaction eluded him. He found himself distracted during meetings, his thoughts wandering, his temper shorter than it had been. He snapped at employees for minor mistakes, ignored the congratulations that came with each new success, and spent long nights pacing his penthouse, staring at the city lights as if they could answer questions he refused to ask himself. It was as if an invisible thread was pulling him, drawing him towards something he couldn't yet see, something he didn't even know he'd been missing. Neither Alexander nor Eleanor could have imagined how close their worlds were to colliding again. Fate was moving quietly in the background, arranging pieces on a board they had both tried to abandon. The man who had once closed the door to protect his empire, and the woman who had walked away carrying more than just her own broken heart, were both on a path that could no longer be avoided. The question wasn't if they would meet again, but when, and if Alexander would recognize the reflection of himself when he looked into the eyes of the child he had never known. The inevitable meeting. It was a warm spring afternoon when the collision finally occurred, though neither Alexander nor Eleanor could have predicted it. Alexander had just concluded a series of meetings with international investors and was headed to a high-profile dinner at one of the city's most exclusive hotels. A gleaming black limousine rolled to the curb, and the marble steps leading to the entrance glistened in the sunlight. Alexander adjusted the cuffs of his pale gray suit, his expression a carefully composed mask of calm authority that had become second nature. The cameras of a gossip magazine snapped photos nearby, but he barely noticed them. He was a man who commanded attention wherever he went, his presence as much a performance as reality. Yet beneath the polished surface, there was still the emptiness he could never quite shake. Just as Alexander was about to enter, another limousine pulled up. He glanced over, distracted, expecting to see more of the city's elite arriving for the event. But what he saw instead stopped him cold. The door opened, and a young woman stepped out, her dark hair catching the light, her brown eyes alert and steady. She was dressed simply, but with a quiet elegance that drew the eye even among the surrounding opulence. For a moment, Alexander thought his mind was playing tricks on him. He hadn't seen Eleanor in 6 years. He had buried the memory of her face deep under layers of denial. But there she was, standing just a few feet away, unchanged and yet profoundly different. And before he could process any emotion, another figure emerged from the car. A boy of about 6, his dark hair ruffled by the breeze, and his eyes so piercingly blue that Alexander felt as if he were staring into a mirror. The boy adjusted the strap on his small jacket and looked around with curiosity, his hand reaching for Eleanor's without hesitation. Alexander's breath caught. It wasn't possible, yet the evidence stood before him. The resemblance was undeniable. His eyes, his gaze, even the way the boy tilted his chin with quiet defiance. Every detail screamed the truth. This was his son. Alexander's polished composure faltered for the first time in years. He felt his legs grow weak, his chest tighten, as if the weight of the world had suddenly pressed down on him. He wanted to move, to speak, but the voice was trapped in his throat. He saw how Eleanor smoothed the child's hair, her expression serene and protective, and he realized she had carried this secret alone for all these years. The boy he had demanded be erased from existence had grown into a living, breathing being who now stood before him, with the same blue eyes he saw in the mirror every morning. Eleanor noticed him then. Their eyes met across the polished steps of the hotel, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to fade. The hum of traffic, the chatter of the guests, the click of the cameras, it all vanished. Her gaze was sharp, filled with something he couldn't name. Not just anger or pain, but also resilience. the kind of strength that is born only from years of carrying a burden unassisted. She tightened her grip on the child's hand and moved to walk past him, her chin held high, refusing to acknowledge his shock. But before she could, the boy pulled on her sleeve and looked directly at Alexander. "Mommy?" the boy asked quietly, his voice clear enough for Alexander to hear. "Is that him?" The word cut Alexander like a blade. His chest tightened, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. The child's innocent question carried the entire weight of lost years, of decisions made in anger and arrogance, of a door that had slammed shut and should never have been closed. Alexander wanted to fall to his knees, to scream, to explain, but he could do nothing but stand frozen as Eleanor gently guided her son past him. Her eyes never softened, her steps never faltered. He turned to watch them go, his entire body shaking, his mind reeling in chaos. For 6 years he had lived as if his decisions were final, as if he had erased the past with a single word. Yet there it was, alive and undeniable, walking away from him in the form of a child who carried his face and his blood. For the first time in his life, Alexander, the man who had never wavered, never faltered, never yielded, felt powerless. And as the limousine door closed behind them, he knew with a certainty no wealth, no empire, no carefully constructed wall could shield him from the truth any longer. That night, long after the dinner had ended and the hotel lights had dimmed, Alexander sat in his penthouse, staring out at the city, haunted by the image of the child's blue eyes. He couldn't escape it. The reflection he had denied for so long had found him, and nothing in his life would ever be the same again. What do you think will happen next? Will Alexander try to connect with Daniel and Eleanor? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. The path to redemption. Alexander didn't sleep that night. He sat alone in his penthouse, a glass of untouched whiskey on the table beside him, the city stretching endlessly below the windows, like a kingdom he no longer felt he owned. The vision of the child's face, so startlingly like his own, replayed in his mind over and over. He tried to bury himself in numbers, to flip through documents left on his desk, but the words became a blur. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Eleanor's expression. Steady, unbreakable, filled with strength and a quiet accusation. And then he saw the innocent gaze of the child, the question that had pierced his chest more fiercely than any business failure or betrayal. Is that him? For the first time in his life, Alexander felt something he couldn't quantify, something that left him breathless and shaking. Fear, not the fear of losing a deal or of scandal or even of failure, but the fear that he had lost something irreplaceable long ago and could never get it back. The idea that there was a son out there who carried his blood, who had grown up without him, who might even hate him without knowing his name, left him hollow. He thought of the night Eleanor had come to him with the truth, when he had chosen pride over passion, arrogance over love. He had told her to disappear, and she had obeyed. But she had not destroyed the life that had been growing inside her. She had protected it. She had nurtured it. And in doing so, she had created something more magnificent than he ever deserved. By morning, Alexander knew he couldn't go on as if nothing had happened. He sought out Eleanor's number, a task that would have been impossible for most men, but not for him. With the resources at his disposal, he found her in a matter of hours, though when he finally held the phone in his hand, staring at the digits on the screen, he hesitated. His thumb hovered over the call button, his pulse racing in a way he hadn't felt since he was a child. It was absurd. He had faced down senators and billionaires without blinking, yet the idea of hearing Eleanor's voice again made him feel like a coward. Finally, with a breath that shook more than he wished to admit, he pressed the button and heard the line ring. When Eleanor's voice answered, steady and cautious, Alexander almost hung up. But then he heard a sound in the background, a child's laugh, light and carefree, and he knew it was his son. His throat tightened, and words failed him for a moment. Eleanor's silence stretched, her patience wearing thin until she finally spoke his name. She didn't say his in return. Instead, she asked, cool and clipped, "Why are you calling me?" Alexander wanted to explain everything, to pour out the regret that had been festering inside him since the moment he had seen them outside the hotel. But all he could manage was the truth, stripped of any eloquence. "I saw him," he said. "I saw our son." The silence on the other end was heavier than any accusation. When Eleanor spoke again, her voice was controlled, but he could hear the tremor beneath it. "You lost the right to call him that the day you told me to disappear." Her words cut deep, but he didn't hang up. Instead, he asked for something he never thought he would beg for, an opportunity to see the child again. Eleanor's refusal was immediate. She told him Daniel had grown up without him, that he didn't need the chaos Alexander brought, that she had built a life strong enough to protect her son from the man who had abandoned them. Alexander listened to her, absorbing every word, but he didn't give up. He promised he wouldn't interrupt their lives, that he only wanted to see his son from a distance, if that was all she could allow. Eleanor scoffed at the idea, anger igniting in her voice, and ended the call. Alexander sat staring at the phone long after the line had gone dead. The weight of her words crushed him, but it did not extinguish the fire that had ignited in his chest. The days turned into weeks, but Alexander did not give up. He showed up outside Daniel's school. He never approached. He just watched from across the street as Eleanor walked her son there every morning. He memorized the way Daniel's hand fit in hers, the way he laughed at something she whispered to him, the way he looked so alive in a way Alexander hadn't felt in years. It was both a torture and a salvation. He told himself he would wait, that he would endure her anger, her mistrust, her walls, if it meant that one day his son might look at him without confusion or fear. Eleanor, for her part, noticed him. She felt his gaze even when she pretended not to, her anger simmering with the audacity of his presence. She wanted to hate him. She wanted to drive him away again. But each time Daniel laughed, she found herself wondering if she was wrong to deny a father who now seemed desperate to atone. Her heart wrestled with itself, torn between protecting her son from a man who had once abandoned them and acknowledging the reality that Alexander was no longer the same cold figure who had slammed the door 6 years ago. The tension between them grew, unspoken but undeniable. Alexander was no longer content to live in silence, and Eleanor could no longer pretend he didn't exist. They both knew a confrontation was inevitable, one that would decide not only their future, but the future of the child, whose blue eyes bound them in a way they could not escape. The surrender of pride. Eleanor had managed to avoid him for weeks, but fate had a way of forcing collisions when neither party was ready. It happened on a Saturday morning at the small park near their neighborhood, a place Daniel loved because of the swings that creaked when the wind blew and the pond where the ducks gathered for breadcrumbs. Eleanor had taken him there after a long week. Her plan was simple: let him run and laugh and allow herself to breathe in the tranquility. She never expected Alexander to show up, tall and unmistakable in a custom suit that looked almost too sharp for such a modest place. She saw him before Daniel did, her stomach clenched with that familiar mix of anger and dread, but she had no chance to retreat. Daniel's eyes caught the stranger's form, and instead of flinching, he froze, his small hand tightening in hers. His expression was one she had never seen before, curiosity mixed with recognition, as if some part of him knew instinctively what his heart had long suspected. Alexander approached slowly, not with the arrogance he carried into boardrooms, but with a kind of hesitation that looked foreign on him, as if he were treading on fragile glass. His eyes never left Daniel's face, and Eleanor saw something raw in them, something she hadn't believed possible from him. Fear, not of power or of loss, but of rejection. When he finally stopped a few feet away, the silence between them was heavy, broken only by the chatter of children playing nearby. Eleanor's instinct screamed at her to protect her son, to pull him into her arms and walk away, but Daniel's grip loosened. He took a hesitant step forward, his eyes fixed on Alexander's, and in a voice just above a whisper, he asked, "Are you my daddy?" The words shattered Alexander. For 6 years, he had built walls, had hidden behind wealth and authority. Yet a single question from a child he had never held cut through it all. His throat tightened, his voice was trapped, and when he finally answered, his tone was unsteady in a way that even surprised him. "Yes, Daniel," he said softly. "I am." He expected anger, perhaps tears, but instead, Daniel simply stared, his expression unreadable, as if he were pondering whether this stranger was worthy of the word. Eleanor's chest ached at the sight, torn between the need to protect her son from disappointment and the understanding that this was a moment she could no longer avoid. They sat together on a nearby bench, an uncomfortable triangle bound by silence and unspoken words. Daniel asked questions with the blunt honesty only children possess. "Why weren't you there? Where did you go? Why did you leave us?" Each one cut into Alexander, and for once, he did not hide behind excuses or charm. He told the truth, as much as a man who had once been blinded by arrogance could admit. He confessed that he had been a coward, that he had chosen ambition over love, and that he would regret it for the rest of his life. Eleanor watched him carefully, waiting for a manipulation, some twist to absolve himself. But instead, she saw a man stripped of pretense, humbled in front of the son he had never held. Daniel listened, his young mind struggling to grasp the complexities of adult failure, but he heard enough to feel sincerity. His small hand reached out cautiously, settling on top of Alexander's, and the gesture almost undid him. Alexander leaned forward, tears he didn't bother to hide falling as he whispered, "I don't deserve this, but I'll spend every day proving to you that I can be better." For the first time, Eleanor saw not the ruthless CEO who had shattered her world, but a man who was broken and desperate to rebuild something he feared he had lost forever. The days that followed were tentative steps toward something neither of them knew how to define. Alexander showed up at the park again, bringing books for Daniel, listening as he talked about school and his dreams of becoming an astronaut. He offered to walk him to school, to help with his homework, to do the small things fathers often take for granted. Eleanor watched him with cautious eyes, still wary of the man who had once slammed the door in her face, but she couldn't ignore the way Daniel's smile widened, the way his laughter became more whole with each visit. A wall inside her, one she had built brick by brick over years of pain, began to crack. Still, trust was not restored easily. One night, after Alexander had left, Daniel looked at her and asked, "Is he really going to stay this time?" The question hurt her more deeply than she expected. She kissed him on the forehead and promised him she would protect him no matter what. But inside, she wondered if Alexander was capable of keeping the promise he had silently made with every desperate glance. She told herself that time would reveal the truth, and until then, she would stay on guard, as she always had. Alexander, however, knew he had no other choice but to stay. He had spent years building an empire of glass and steel, but now he understood that his entire life meant nothing without the little boy with blue eyes who had called him Daddy for the first time. And though Eleanor still kept her distance, though her eyes still showed caution, he began to hope that maybe he could win not only his son's trust, but hers as well. Time moved forward, not in giant leaps, but in small, fragile steps, and each one led Alexander closer to a life he never imagined he would want. Rebuilding, the weeks became months, and with each visit, with each shared laugh or quiet conversation, the distance between father and son began to shrink. Daniel grew more comfortable around him. He no longer observed him with cautious eyes, but instead ran to him at the park or eagerly pulled on his sleeve to show him a new drawing or to tell him something he had learned in school. Alexander marveled at each discovery, each small detail of his son's world, and though he grieved for the 6 years he had missed, he cherished every moment he was now allowed to share. What shocked him most was not the child's resemblance to himself, but the warmth and gentleness that Daniel had inherited from Eleanor, qualities Alexander realized he had once been too blind to see in her. Eleanor remained cautious, her heart torn between the instinct to protect her son from a possible disappointment and the undeniable evidence that Alexander was changing. She saw him arrive, not with the arrogance of a man used to commanding attention, but with the quiet patience of someone willing to earn his place. He no longer brought gifts as if they could buy affection, but instead offered time, helping Daniel with school projects, sitting cross-legged on the floor to build model airplanes, or simply listening to him with a concentration Eleanor had never seen from him before. Each act chipped away at the image she had held of the cold, unyielding man who had ordered her to disappear. Yet the memory of that night never fully left her, and she often lay awake long after Daniel had fallen asleep, wondering if trust was something she could ever fully give back. Alexander, for his part, was determined to prove himself not with words, but with persistence. He adjusted his life in ways that even astounded him. Meetings that once consumed his every waking hour were rescheduled or delegated. Business trips were cut short. Entire weekends were cleared. His colleagues noted the change, whispering about his distraction. But Alexander no longer cared about appearances. The empire he had built still mattered, but it no longer defined him. He found that what filled the emptiness inside him was not another acquisition or a headline, but the sound of his son's laughter echoing in a modest apartment, or the quiet smile Eleanor gave him when she thought he wasn't looking. The turning point came one night when Alexander joined them for dinner at Eleanor's apartment. It was a small, ordinary meal, pasta with sauce and a loaf of bread from the neighborhood bakery. But to Alexander, it felt like a feast. He sat at the table with them, watching Daniel chatter about his day, seeing Eleanor laugh softly at his enthusiasm, and something shifted inside him. He realized this was what he had been missing all this time, the simple intimacy of family, the connection that money could never replicate. When Daniel reached across the table to give him a piece of bread, Alexander felt a lump in his throat. It was such a small gesture, but it was filled with trust and acceptance, and it tore down the last of the walls he had built around his heart. Later that night, after Daniel had gone to bed, Alexander stood at the door, unable to leave. Eleanor stood across from him, her arms crossed, her eyes still cautious but softer than they had been in years. He struggled to find the words, his voice hoarse with the emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. "I can't erase what I did," he admitted, his gaze fixed on hers. "I can't give you back the years I stole, or the nights you spent alone, or the tears you shed because of me. But I can give you everything I have now. I can give Daniel a father who will never leave again. And if you'll let me, I want to give you the man you deserved all along." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't respond right away. She studied him, looking for any trace of the man she had once known, the one who had broken her heart. What she saw instead was someone humbled, someone who had been stripped of pride and remade by the love he had once rejected. Slowly, she reached for his hand, not as a promise of forgiveness, but as an opening, a chance for something new to grow where everything had once been destroyed. The weeks that followed solidified what had begun that night. Alexander became a constant presence, no longer hovering on the fringes of their lives, but stepping fully into them. He walked Daniel to school in the mornings. He attended parent-teacher conferences. He learned to cook simple meals with Eleanor, guiding him in the kitchen, though they both laughed at his clumsy attempts. Eleanor began to let down her guard, not all at once, but in fragments, until one night she found herself leaning against him on the couch, with Daniel asleep on both their laps, and she realized that the life she had once believed to be impossible was unfolding before her. Alexander never stopped carrying his regret, but it no longer consumed him. Instead, it fueled his determination to honor the second chance he had been given. He knew he would never forget the moment he had told Eleanor to disappear, but now he understood that love wasn't about erasing mistakes. It was about choosing each day to be better. He had once slammed the door on a family he could have had, but now he was inside with them, the door standing wide open, vowing never to close it again. And so, against all odds, their story did not end in bitterness, but in something unexpected and extraordinary. From rejection came resilience, from pain came strength, and from one man's arrogance came redemption. For Eleanor, for Alexander, and most of all, for Daniel, the broken pieces of the past had reformed into a future none of them had believed possible. One built not on pride but on love.